there are still the targets that are temporarily out of reach. That Bashkortostan strike that took place, I believe, yesterday. It's 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine, but there are targets that are much further than that. And we should find ways to deal with them as well, because Russian industry can collapse, and we can do it actually easily. Having all that resource that United States have, U.S. Navy have, I'm talking about the long-range weapons, we can deal proper damage to Russia and actually force it to negotiate, and it will not take a lot of time actually, provided all the intel from the United States. But at this point, we're fighting with what we have.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we are joined by Operator Starsky, a Ukrainian military veteran, observer at UATV and co-founder of the Propaganda Study Institute. Starsky, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, over the weekend, we've had reports from Zelensky himself that Ukrainian troops are now advancing in Dobropilya, around that area where there was a pretty significant Russian push that then appeared to be cut off. What can you tell us about what's going on here?
So, first of all, it looks like a trap for the Russian troops that decided to penetrate deeper into our territory in that area about a month ago. And they basically did it all of a sudden, unexpectedly, even despite the fact that there was this absolutely massive line of defense, actually several lines of defense that were built previously, specifically to deflect their attacks. And as a result of this attack, Ukraine managed to basically lure them into trap and cut that part of the Russian personnel from the rest of their troops. And doesn't matter what the Russians are trying to do now, but it's very, very unlikely that those Russians will return alive. Actually, it's very interesting to observe that currently all over the front lines, especially in the regions like Zaporizhia, for example, Ukrainian troops keep liberating, clearing small settlements from the Russian troops. We cannot really compare this to, for example, Russian progress, which is, let's say, very, very much incremental, and the front line is basically stalling, stationary since 2023, I would say. But whatever progress they have is it cannot be compared to 2022, 2023. I'm sorry. In 2022, they would take 1,000 or 1,200 square kilometers in a single day. Now it takes them almost a year. But at the same time, we can see this small progress, and it's actually very encouraging to see Ukrainian troops being able to conduct such counteroffensive and actually liberate smaller settlements. To me personally, this tells several things. First of all, that the war of attrition for Russians is much harder than they anticipated. And second is that because they are running out of their armored vehicles and tanks, their storage is basically almost depleted, with several thousand tanks that are left there in very, very bad condition, and takes a lot of resources and money and time to refurbish them. So that is one of the reasons why we can see that. And another reason is, again, despite the overwhelming personnel, despite the manpower that Russia has, I don't really see them being able to conduct any significant offensives or even have enough troops to defend those settlements. Currently, what they're doing is they're literally shuffling groups of their drone operators, groups of their Spetsnaz, groups of their paratroopers, and try to cover different gaps in different sectors, but it doesn't work really well for them.
I was going to say, because the push into Dobropilya was somewhat related to the push around Pokrovsk, which is a city that Russia have been trying to take from Ukraine for over a year now, haven't they? I mean, are we starting to see a real faltering of Russia's capability even to inch forward in the way they've been able to for the last 2 years?
Yeah, absolutely. What I see is that You know, when you watch Russian television, you hear a lot of interesting statements. For example, recently the Solovyov, the top Russian propagandist, he was openly calling on the Russian national television to invade Europe. He basically called for a full-scale invasion of European countries, strike London, strike Brussels, and other cities. But you see, somehow on their way to Berlin and Brussels and London, the mighty Russian army stumbled upon a tiny Ukrainian town of Pokrovsk. How did it happen? I have no idea.
Well, exactly. And it's being watched here in the West as well. Donald Trump has again threatened to send Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. Russia have responded, as you say, across their media outlets, but as well from the government spokespeople themselves, that they won't be able to tell if a Tomahawk launched by Ukraine was nuclear armed or not. The thing about this, though, is there's no evidence that Ukraine have developed their own nuclear weapons. No one is providing nuclear warheads to Ukraine, least of all for the Tomahawk missile. There is a game being played here by Moscow, isn't there, in the terms of their language they use on the world stage?
I agree on that. Peskov in that interview mentioned the dirty bomb, actually, and I think he was even smiling when he was saying that because it's an old fake that they created, I believe, back in 2022. Even earlier, you know, when I served in the National Guard, I heard this myth about the dirty bomb that Kiev is gonna drop on Donbass or something like that. um, and this myth was very very popular, I think still is, you know, so they just uh, drag it from like a drawer time to time. But we can see some very interesting rhetorics again. The Russians are claiming, starting from Putin in Valdai, claiming that this weapon is not going to change anything on the front line in Ukraine. On the other hand, we can see how nervous they are, and basically this um, update, all those news, all those rumors about the tomahawks coming to Ukraine are provoking enormous hysteria and anxiety among Russians, because all sorts of Russian spokesmen, including Medvedev, including basically everyone, they are talking about it. They threaten the civilized world with nuclear apocalypse. But again, they were saying the same in 2022 when HIMARS systems were coming to Ukraine. They were saying the same in 2023, 2024 when F-16s were delivered. And basically nothing changed much. One of the reasons, I might repeat myself, but one of the reasons why I don't see Russia striking Berlin, London, or Washington, D.C., specifically Miami, of course, is because they don't want to kill their own kids who live, study, work there. They don't want to kill, you know, the wives of the Russian oligarchs who live there massively and enjoy life in a civilized country. So I don't see that happening.
And Trump has also had a phone call with Zelensky over the weekend about the idea of providing Tomahawk, reportedly. I mean, there is a much warmer relationship now between Zelensky and the White House than there was earlier this year, wasn't there? I mean, there's certainly a complicated relationship going on there, but there must be a more confident feeling among Ukrainians now that you know the US uh, is sort of tacitly giving the green light for Ukraine to do these long range strikes into Russia, something that even the previous administration under Biden had never given.
First of all, I completely agree on that. The relations, we can see that they're now much warmer, much friendlier, which is something that all Ukrainians anticipated, of course. And at the same time, we will be much more happier if we finally receive those missiles, the Tomahawks missiles, or at least enough Patriot missiles with enough numbers and proper permissions to use them against the Russian targets. I'm talking about the Tomahawks. Patriots, we know how to use. Because there are several problems that we still should understand how to solve. First of all, those missiles are not, let's say, their number is limited, and the United States don't produce thousands of those missiles. Ukraine needs hundreds of them actually in order to break Russia immediately and effectively. And if we are given not enough missiles, if we're given, let's say, 10, 20, that might introduce some changes, but very, very locally, and that would be point strikes. Ukraine needs much more reliable long range weaponry that will deliver necessary blow to the Russian military industry, Russian oil industry, and only then this will bring some sort of results. Currently, there's half of the Russian oil refineries that are still functioning. And also, besides oil refineries, new targets emerged, such as Russian power facilities. Again, Russian power facilities power Russian industry that produces tanks and missiles, and I think they should be shut down as well. And not only because of that, but also because I think after almost 4 years of Russia's absolutely atrocious strikes on Ukrainian energy infrastructure, I think we should also pay back, because we cannot just receive those strikes in the same gates and do nothing. I think it was a proper thing when President Zelensky said that we will be responding symmetrically to the Russian strikes on our energy infrastructure. I think it's a proper thing.
Yeah, and what we do know that has been supplied to Ukraine by the US is this further intelligence on energy infrastructure targets in Russia. The effect so far has been to take offline up to 40% of Russia's oil refinery capability. In this case, I mean, given that Ukraine has done that so far with its own weapons, is the intelligence provision that Trump has now supposedly given the green light to, is that more important than the armaments themselves?
It's as important. It's as important because there is absolutely no way you can use such sophisticated weaponry without proper intelligence. And of course, the Tomahawk missiles themselves, they are integrated naturally to work properly with the American intelligence provided by the American experts. So we absolutely need this intelligence. It's crucial. Even without the Tomahawks, it's still crucial, because you can see what sort of damage Ukraine managed to deliver to the terrorist federation without using Tomahawks, with using whatever Ukraine actually produced on its own territory, long-range drones and long-range missiles, flamingos. We use those extremely effectively, and also the naval drones, by the way, that also strike Russian naval oil terminals. Again, they're extremely, extremely effective. By the way, recently Russians showcased one of the captured Ukrainian drones, the naval drones that actually, besides enormous amount of explosives on board, it also carried FPV drones that were supposed to be launched from these drones. So Ukraine already, with those technologies that we have, we are able to deal to do this absolutely enormous damage to the Russian industry, but it's not enough, because again, Russia is big. Russia has a much bigger economy. Russia has a big industry, military industry, and of course, it has a lot of resources. Speaking like manpower, that they can use, and we need much more weaponry to fight against it properly. Again, there are still targets that are temporarily out of reach. That Bashkortostan strike that took place, I believe, yesterday, it's 1,400 kilometers from Ukraine, but there are targets that are much further than that. And we should find ways to deal with them as well, because Russian industry can collapse, and we can do it actually easily. Having all that resource that United States have, U.S. Navy have, I'm talking about the long-range weapons, we can deal proper damage to Russia and actually force it to negotiate, and it will not take a lot of time, actually. Provided all the intel from the United States, but at this point we're fighting with what we have.
And just finally on Tomahawk itself, Russia has escalated its rhetoric around the possible deployment of this missile in this conflict. At the same time, we're seeing increasing incursions and sort of sub threshold drone attacks going on in Europe outside of Ukraine and Russia. Um, how do these two come together? I mean, it presumably is not a coincidence that we've seen this escalation in rhetoric and also potentially Russian action elsewhere in Europe as well.
I think they are related, of course, because Russia is waging its hybrid warfare, and they're finding new way to, first of all, scare the citizens of European Union, inflict fear and inconfidence and things like that. And of course, the ISW, for example, on 11th of October, published their new research regarding the possibility of Russia's full-scale invasion of Europe that might actually happen because Russia is currently stockpiling weaponry, even despite the fact that they're throwing all they can against Ukraine. But at the same time, they are refurbishing their T-72 tanks. They're trying to expand the production of T-90 tanks. And also, we can see their military bases growing, like base near the Estonian border. So we can see that Russia is preparing for something long term. And that hybrid warfare that we can see happening over Europe using those Russian drones, that is to me personally is a sign of preparation, because not only it brings psychological effect against the citizens of the European Union, but also they basically study the rules of engagement on the ground, how the law enforcement in different countries coordinates their actions with military, with air defense. So they study, they conduct intelligence, and this will be used in the future against Europeans. So, in my personal opinion, they are basically preparing. But again, their hybrid warfare, their psychological warfare is also very, very strong. We can see them trying to rattle their sabers with their submarines, all of a sudden submerging somewhere near the French coast. We can see their green men on the Estonian border, again, all of a sudden emerging from the forest. So we will see that happening, and we will see, I believe, even more drones flying over European cities, because in Valdai, for example, Putin mentioned that those young people who launched drones over the airports, which didn't happen much previously. That's literally like locals, and basically what it tells me, it tells that Russia will be probably recruiting local people and telling them to launch those drones to disrupt air connectivity and things like that, and also collect intelligence, because all of those launches, they are not chaotic. They are very much systematic. They take place over strategic objects all across Europe, and they collect intelligence.
But how do you think the Kremlin can continue to sell this increasing militarization to the Russian population? I mean, as you mentioned, in the war in Ukraine alone, there are now, because of this, there are now queues for petrol in Russia itself. There are these increasing Ukrainian strikes that are now backed by US intelligence. And this idea that we had at the start of the Trump administration of a quick negotiated peace settlement where Russia could at least claim to have gained territory, that now seems to be behind us realistically. How does the Kremlin then sell the idea of further aggression to its own people?
Well, generally speaking, in Russia, it's not that bad, because, again, Russian recruits receive impressive sums of money, $30,000. That's a one-time payment for signing contracts. So that's big money, and they're very, very attractive, not only for Russians but also for people from other countries, like Cuba, for example, and other countries, African countries. And Russians, you see, they got used to live in such bad conditions. So, for example, queues at the gas stations doesn't scare them much. All right, so they can withstand. For example, in the 90s, they've seen much worse. And 90s is basically when Russia only survived because the only source of protein for Russians was cheap American chicken called bush legs that America generously sold them with a very, very cheap price. So they are used to live in bad conditions, what for us is a complete disaster. To Russians, it's like, yeah, they can survive. So I think something much different should happen, and it should involve changes in in political life, of course, in social life, economically, when, for example, Russians will be struggling finding some necessary products or provision in the markets. And this happens time to time. We saw them fighting over sugar, we saw them fighting over the toilet paper, we saw them fighting over eggs, chicken. Potato, I don't remember, but things change. Fuel crisis, for example, in Ukraine, we also had fuel crisis in 2022, which we managed to solve by shifting our storages, by buying fuel from our partners. And I believe that Russia can actually do the same. They can introduce some new rules to buy fuel from other countries. And it will be probably one of the solutions that they can make. But on the other hand, what we can see right now is that Russia is struggling very, very much, struggling with absence of armored vehicles to support their attacks, struggles again with fuel, struggles with air defense. And 2026, in my personal opinion, I would not bet my kidney, at least not the right one. But I believe that 2026 will be a crucial point in this war. At least middle 2026, we will see.
And meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, if you will, Kaja Kallas, Vice President of the European Commission, is in Kiev today discussing further funding for Ukraine going into winter. But the big discussion for the European Union at the moment seems to be about the use of these frozen Russian assets, or the interest paid from them. Do you think we're closer now to these assets being used to help fund Ukraine as the US continues to try and withdraw its financial support for Ukraine?
I think we are closer, but how closer, it's really, really hard to tell because we were talking about them actually since 2022, and it's been almost 4 years. So it's very hard to tell. Currently, we can see that Europe is actually waking up, but again, Europe was waking up in 2023, 2024. It's a very, very long process. It gives me hope to see, for example, European leaders taking the Russian threat seriously and actually preparing for this on different levels, not as actively as I would like, because, for example, me as a Ukrainian, I remember how the war in Ukraine started and how much prepared we were to this full-scale invasion. But on the other hand, maybe they will also find this understanding or mechanisms in the nearest future to finally use those assets properly, also rearm Ukraine and help Ukraine rearm and develop those countries, European countries, our partners, because Ukraine has absolutely enormous experience right now, not only in terms of drones, which Ukraine is probably leading country in the world in terms of the drone warfare at this moment, but also in terms of tactics, in terms of using combined forces and things like that.
And does the presence of European representatives like Kaja Kallas, visiting Ukraine, speaking with the Ukrainian government about funding and such, does it bring a level of confidence among Ukrainians in the support Europe can provide?
I would say so. Of course, it looks encouraging to see such guests coming from European countries. But at the same time, we would be much more satisfied seeing actually weaponry coming to Ukraine because, again, in North Ukraine, Chernihiv, for example, it was mentioned several times that we have some problems with intercepting Russian aerial threats over there. Russians are changing tactics of using their ballistic missiles, for example, so they're getting harder to intercept, even with the Patriot systems. They changed their trajectory, and we need to find more solution to that. And besides this fact, we should also remember that again, Europe is preparing to defend itself, and Ukraine should also help European countries with their experience. The other day, I read this on the Russian Telegram channel that. Russians were very, very much nagging because there are military exercise involving Ukrainian soldiers and NATO troops on the NATO territory. And basically, Russians were saying that it's not like NATO is considering accepting Ukraine as a member. It's like NATO wants to become a member of Ukraine, and also it's kind of funny.
And just to finish, Starsky, Melania Trump has announced over the weekend that she's made an agreement directly with the Russian government to begin returning Ukrainian children. This could be quite a major breakthrough, couldn't it?
I would say so. On the other hand, we saw that they returned 8 kids out of 20,000 that were kidnapped by Russians. So it is a big process. It is a long process, I believe. On the other hand, we saw the response, for example, from Maria Zakharova, I believe, who said that even though they returned Ukrainian kids, but Russia never kidnapped Ukrainian kids, which is something that I cannot really explain how it happened then. So it's really, really good to see such efforts coming from the United States, from United States First Lady, that she is trying to help Ukraine return our children, because this is something that back in 2015, even years before the full-scale Russian invasion, we were thinking what to do with the kids that study, for example, or live on the occupied territory, because they have never spoken Ukrainian language in their lives. They don't know who they are, and they were brought up in this Russian parallel reality, in the Russian propaganda. And same thing we will see here, because there's now tens of thousands of Ukrainian kids on the Russian territory. And I believe that if Melania Trump is involved, and generally the United States are involved, we have a hope that they will help us.
Well, Operator Starsky, thank you very much for joining me today on Frontline.
Thank you so much. It's a privilege.
You've been watching or listening to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. For more on the war in Ukraine, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for a membership, or you can hear all the latest news and analysis on Times Radio, or read it at thetimes.com. And remember, we are in both podcast and video form. You can find us on your favourite podcast platform. It's Times Radio's Frontline, or you can watch us on Times Radio's YouTube channel. Thanks very much. Goodbye.